Hey, I'm Callie. Thanks so much for watching Graceland Online. Graceland Church exists to see lives transformed in the neighborhoods, the generations, and the nations through Jesus Christ. The teaching that you're about to hear is based on the Bible, and we believe that it will be inspiring and relevant to your life. And if you're here because you're searching for answers to tough questions and looking for help on how to navigate life, we would love for you to text us with any questions or if you just need someone to talk to. And again, thanks for watching Graceland Online. We're praying for you, and we hope that this video will be an encouragement to you on your spiritual journey.
Hey, thanks so much for watching this episode of Graceland Online. My name is Nate. I serve as one of the leaders at Graceland Church. And what we want to do for the next several weeks is we want to talk about emotions. In fact, the month of May is Mental Awareness Month. Mental clarity, being emotionally healthy. In fact, there has been a myriad of books written over the last 10, 15 years about emotional intelligence, about being emotionally healthy. And you know, like if you're emotionally healthy with your emotions, boy, that just really will influence in so many different areas. And so we want to take some time, 8 to 10 minutes, to talk about some emotions that we all go through. And what I wanted to talk through ever so briefly in this episode is depression. Now, I want to read you an excerpt from a book I read years ago. And depression is something that hits close to my home. I've had family members that have been really almost crippled by it. It's been debilitating. It's been difficult. It's been a struggle. And sometimes they get answers, and sometimes they don't get answers. And sometimes there's this fog. Let me read to you this excerpt. Depression is just this attached, meaningless fog where you can't feel anything about anything. It's this malady or the sickness that hits close to your heart, and family members and close friends have struggled with it. Undoubtedly, you may have or have had friends that struggle with it. Though I've not battled with it personally, I've not had pervasive bouts of depression. There has been times where there's been this kind of melancholy, this discouragement that's taken up residence in my soul internally in terms of who I am. And people who've struggled with depression have likened it to a little piece of hell, or an intense sadness, or an intense listlessness that seems to continually claw away at hope and joy and contentment or peace. Depression. And so what I want to do just for the next couple minutes is to give you kind of 5, not action points, but maybe principles, behaviors, mindsets for you to think about. I do not in any capacity think this is like some solution to problems. There's counseling, there's medicine, there's seeing doctors, there's friends, there's family members, there's understanding your background and your environment and your circumstances. And you need all hands on deck with something like depression. But what I want to do ever so briefly is just kind of give you maybe 5 things to think about. The first is this, and this is for believers in Jesus and for people who aren't believers in Jesus. Certainly here at Graceland Online, we want to point you to Jesus, who understands emotions. We believe Jesus was God, but we also believe Jesus was man. The Bible in the book of Hebrews, which is written in the New Testament, it talks about how Jesus was a man who was full of sorrows, and he can empathize and sympathize with us in our weakness. He can identify with our struggles and our deficiencies and what's going on. Though he was perfect, he can come alongside of us in a compassionate manner. So we want to point you to Jesus continually. But I want to give you 5 little action points or mindsets to think about as you think about depression or anxiety or struggles. First is sorrow. To acknowledge that you're in a place where you're discouraged. It is okay to not be okay. We live in a culture where we want to constantly put on a front, and we want to be superficial and plastic smiles. And when people say, how you doing? And we'll say we're doing great, when in reality, internally, there's this listlessness, there's discouragement, there's this melancholy. The Bible is replete with examples of biblical writers and characters talking about, I'm struggling, I'm not doing well. Someone just acknowledge, I'm sorrowful, I'm struggling. Secondly, don't believe the lies that often are told by depression or anxiety or melancholy. They'll say things, there's no meaning to what's going on, and there's no light at the end of the tunnel. And rightly facing the darkness of depression is oftentimes a matter of receiving what's going on in your life. So certainly there's difficulty, certainly there's struggle, certainly there's hardships, and many of you are going through some serious things. But in those moments, you can look around, and it helps me at times to take a step back from my circumstances and ask the question, is there anything going on right now that's helpful? And oftentimes there's this narrative that plays in our mind and in our heart, and we keep it on replay, keep it on repeat, and we believe there's nothing going on, there's no purpose, there's no meaning, and that's just not true. So sorrow, don't believe the lies that there's nothing or no meaning going on. And then correction. We want to correct our heart. Ed Welch, who's a licensed psychologist and a counselor, had a depressed friend, and here's what they talked about with this exchange. As he was listening to his friends, he said this, I'm going to stop you for a second. Can you hear what's happening? The more that you talk, the more that you despair. I can see it in you. In fact, I can feel it in myself. And here's a plan. Dr. Welch said to his friend, whom he loved and cared for. They had a relationship, so he could say things like this. You probably may not want to say things like this to somebody you don't know and care for and have a close relationship with. But here's what he said. From now on, when you see the wave of malady or discouragement or anxiety or depression, and you have these untruthful ways of interpreting what's going on, that they're crashing down on you, I want to point it out. And I want to try to run away from it with you. Not run away from your problems, but run away from things that grasp our heart and have a struggle and a clasp upon us. And so we want to correct ourselves and not believe all the lies and the narrative that plays in our mind. Fourthly, and this is a hard one, but not the hardest one, would be grit. This is a posture. This is a mindset. This is a resolve that says, keep going. Put one foot in front of the other, right? Oftentimes, in the midst of despair and discouragement, we lose sight, certainly, of Jesus. We lose sight of truth. We lose sight of friendships. We lose sight of what's in front of us, and we're just looking at the malady or the discouragement or the depression, the anxiety, and at times it can be crippling, and that's why we need family, that's why we need friends. Oftentimes that's why we need counseling, that's why we need medical intervention, oftentimes why we need medicine. But I want there needs to be a grit in our hearts to keep going, all right? Fifthly and lastly, and this is perhaps, I think, the most difficult, is that to find happiness or even joy in the midst of discouragement or depression or anxiety. For an individual, perhaps you who has struggled with depression or anxiety or discouragement, giving a word on joy might not only seem counterproductive, but might seem, in fact, downright offensive. And yet there's a book that I read several years ago, and the title of the book is When Your 20s Are Darker Than You Expected. When your 20s are darker than you expected. And here's what he says. He is candid about the misery of depression and anxiety and discouragement and its impact on his own life. And so a word on joy may not only be irrelevant, but it might be discouraging. And he asks a question in this book. When your 20s are darker than you expected, he asks a question. And he was writing this as a religious person, as a spiritual person. Can God give you joy in the midst of hardship? Can God bring something beautiful out of something that we thought was ugly and terrible and horrific? In the midst of whatever you're going through, the answer is yes. Oftentimes we don't see it for days, weeks, months, perhaps years and decades, and that can be sometimes physically crippling and deeply discouraging. But have a grit and a resolve and have people come into your life to help you see a perspective that oftentimes we don't have. We despair in our anxiety and in our discouragement and in our depression, because at times we can't imagine a future without it. But from the biblical point of view, we know that there is a future that follows and awaits us without discouragement, without sickness, without anxiety, without depression. So the month of May, Mental Awareness Month. We'll talk about anger. We'll talk about sadness. We've talked minimally about depression, even more minimally about anxiety. And we just want to have a real quick kind of touch the service, a little touch point about the fact that we are emotional beings. You're an emotional being who's been created by an emotional God. I don't mean like when we say somebody's emotional, boy, they're up and down and they're volatile. God is the same yesterday and today and forever. He does not change. He's steadfast. He's loving. He's faithful. And yet the Bible says that God is an emotional God who's created you and created me. And we are, because we've been created by him, we're emotional beings, among many other things. Jesus, who is both God and man, had a flurry and an array of emotions: sadness, grief, deep discouragement, anger, joy. So as we think about our emotions, we want to point our heart and think about, how did Jesus exemplify these emotions, and how can Jesus help us? How can Jesus enter into the fray? How can Jesus enter into our lives and help us understand who we are, and then to express ourselves in a way that's constructive and helpful and in alignment with his purpose? I hope that encouraged you briefly, minimally. If it does, we'd love for you to like this, to share it, even subscribe it, maybe even point somebody to it. We look forward to talking to you more over the month of May about Mental Awareness Month, about our various emotions that we have in our life. Next time, I'll see you soon.
Thanks again for watching Graceland Online. We hope that God spoke to you today through this video. And again, feel free to text us if you have questions about what you heard, or if there's a way that we might be able to help you. And you can also find more videos and resources at gracelandchurch.online. Thanks again for watching, and we hope that you'll join us again soon.